2017, it is the third building in Chester to have a green living roof to help combat city centre air pollution. Before we move away, please listen carefully to the following safety instructions. To indicate that you wish to leave the bus, please ring the bell to alert the driver. Because standing up can be dangerous, it is essential that you remain seated whilst the bus is in motion. Thank you for your attention. We hope you enjoy your tour of Chester. The royal and ancient city of Chester has its origins in the 1st century. At that time, the Romans established a fortress in the area, known as Castra Diva, and much of the history and architecture has been retained from that time. Throughout the centuries, Chester has evolved to become one of the most popular tourist destinations in the north of England. Ahead is a stretch of the Shropshire Union Canal. However, in medieval times and earlier, it was known to be the site of Chester's jousting croft. Additionally, every Sunday after attending church, it was compulsory for the men and boys of the city to gather here in order to improve their archery skills. The Cheshire Archers, as they became known, were always in the forefront of the army and were able to fire a minimum of 12 arrows a minute. At the Battle of Agincourt in the early 15th century, it is said that thousands of the enemy fell in a very short time. As a result, the enemy became so fearful of the archers that if they were ever able to capture one, then they would immediately amputate the first 2 fingers on each hand, thus ensuring that he would never be able to use the bow again. The bowmen retaliated by holding their arms aloft, waving their still existing fingers in the air, resulting instead to be the origin of the more unsavoury 2-fingered sign used throughout the world today. Frodsham Street is named after a small Cheshire town about 9 miles away to the east. In the medieval period, it was known as Cow Lane because the cattle were driven along here to the markets and slaughterhouses. Excavations nearby have uncovered a large area of hard, beaten clay ground, surrounded by earth banks, which suggests there was a Roman parade ground here about 2,000 years ago. Part of the original Roman fortress walls lie behind the shops to the right. At a break in the buildings ahead on the right, note the freestanding bell tower of the cathedral, which stands along the city wall. Built in 1974, it is named the Addleshaw Tower, after the dean of the cathedral at that time. Designed by George Pace, it was the first freestanding bell tower to be built for a cathedral since the 15th century. Shortly as the bus turns to the left, note the East Gate to the right, and standing proudly above it, Chester's most famous landmark, the East Gate Clock. Built in 1897 to commemorate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, the clock has become the symbol of Chester throughout the world. Nowadays, it is the second most photographed clock in the country after Big Ben in London. Beneath the clock, the East Gate itself was built in 1769 to replace the medieval gateway. Ahead and to the right is one of Chester's original timber frame buildings. Built in 1571, it is typical of the architecture of that time, with the first story overhanging the lower and supported by wooden pillars. In earlier centuries, taxes were paid according to the amount of land taken up by the building area, and consequently, properties such as this were built as small as possible at ground level and extended outwards at first story level, as typified here. Obviously, by doing so, large amounts of money were saved, and one might say that this was an early example of tax evasion. We are now at stop 2, the Old Queen's Head Public House. A light here for the main shopping area, the Bars roundabout and the suburb of Bourton. The old Queen's Head Public House is one of the many black and white timber frame buildings in the city. On one gable the date is sealed as 1508, whilst on the other side it states 1939. During the Civil War in the 17th century, the royal city of Chester was left devastated, with many of its buildings left in ruins. Since the Victorian era, the city has been greatly altered, with new buildings being constructed and older ones being heavily restored, as seen here. We are now at the Bars, an area not actually associated at all with alcoholic beverages, as the name instantly implies. The famous circuit of walls that we see today wasn't its sole defence in medieval times, and the Bars' outer defensive gate stood here to protect the expanding population in the eastern suburbs. During the Civil War in the 17th century, Chester was a royalist stronghold, supporting King Charles I, and as a defensive measure against the invading parliamentarian forces, the royalists built earthworks on either side of the gate, thus embracing all the outlying areas. The gate was demolished in 1770, but the name lives on. We are approaching Stop 3, City Road. A light here for the Premier Inn and other hotels. As the bus crosses over the canal ahead, look to the right. Beyond the apartments is the Lead Shot Tower. It was built in 1799, and by 1801 it was manufacturing lead shot or musket balls to be used in the Napoleonic Wars. Workers carried heavy lead ingots to the top of the tower, where they were then heated in crucibles until they became molten liquid. Arsenic was then added as a hardening agent. This deadly concoction was then poured down the tower, where it passed through large metal sieves, forming globules of lead. It then landed in a bath of water, and when retrieved, it was perfectly spherical lead shot. Before the bus turns to the left, the last building on the right is the Queen Hotel. Built by the railway companies in 1860, it was the most prestigious hotel in the area, and was specifically built to accommodate tourists coming into the city via the railway. The main entrance of the Queen Hotel is actually facing the railway station. Above this entrance stands a statue of Queen Victoria, in whose honour the hotel was named. Note the connecting covered walkway leading from the hotel to the station, and the sign above the open arch offering carriages and horses for hire. Hotel porters use this walkway to escort the guests to and from the station. Many famous guests stayed at the Queen Hotel, such as the actress Lily Langtry, the notorious mistress of Edward VII. Cecil Rhodes, the founder of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, is said to have plotted the Boer War while strolling in the hotel gardens. In 1867, another distinguished guest was Charles Dickens, the famous writer. Arriving in a very severe winter, Dickens complained about his accommodation, comparing his coldness with that of a piece of meat in a larder. We are now at Stop 4, the railway station, a light here for local hotels, New Town and the suburb of Poole. We are now in Station Road and the railway station is on the right. Thomas Brassey, born locally in 1805, was awarded the contract to construct the building. Although not well publicised, he actually became the most prolific railway builder of Victorian times. When Thomas Brassey died in 1870, such was the magnitude of his work, he left £3.2 million, a vast amount of money in those days. The foundation stone for the station was laid in August 1847, and the grand opening took place on August 1st, 1848, which meant that it took less than a year to reach completion, an extraordinary achievement. The fashionable London architect Francis Thompson designed the building in the elegant Italianate style, and the station laid claim to the longest facade in the country when it was built, 1,110 feet long. We now enter Brook Street, and the small building ahead on the right opened as a cocoa house in the Victorian period. As we pass the building, look above the ground floor window, where a decorative sign can be seen, declaring that the building was owned by the Chester Cocoa House Company Limited. Cocoa houses were built by members of the Temperance Society to combat the scourge of alcohol amongst the poor. It was hoped that they would draw the public away from 365 pubs that existed in the city at that time. So cheap was alcohol, it was said that you could get drunk for a penny and dead drunk for tuppence. It is interesting to note that the powerful Quaker chocolate manufacturers, such as Cadbury, Rowntree and Fry, were all members of the Temperance Society, so maybe it could be said there was a bit of method in their madness. Entering Hoole Way, we can see directly ahead of us that Chester Cathedral dominates the skyline. In approximately 660 AD, a small Saxon timber church dedicated to St. Peter and St. Paul was founded here by King Wulfhere, father of St. Werburgh. St. Werburgh was born in the 7th century, and she became a revered nun in the Saxon kingdom of Mercia. After her death in 706, her remains were buried in Handbridge, Staffordshire. In the latter half of the 9th century, Vikings were raiding the country, and in order to protect the saint's relics from the marauding Danes, they were brought here to the church within the fortified walls. A shrine, built to house the relics, still stands in the cathedral today. Major changes occurred on the site after the Battle of Hastings in 1066. William the Conqueror gave Chester into the hands of his nephew, Hugh d'Avranches, better known as Hugh the Wolf. Granting him the earldom of Chester, Hugh later founded a Benedictine abbey here. To the right, Chester's 3 super trees, as they are known, can be seen in the sunken garden on the traffic island. Climbing plants will eventually cover the 7-metre high structures in order to give the appearance of more natural trees. The area has been designed to create a habitat for plants and wildlife to flourish. This environmental project to combat air pollution was inspired by David Attenborough's TV programme Planet Earth, which featured the amazing super trees in Singapore, which vary in height between 25 and 50 metres. We are now travelling along St Oswald's Way. As we cross over the canal, the building on the left, now the Mill Hotel, was originally constructed as a grain mill to process flour. Built in the 1830s, it was known as Griffith's Mill, and in earlier times the canal side would have been lined with buildings such as this. To the right, look out for the row of buildings with tall chimneys known as Parker's Buildings. Comprising 30 flats, they were built in 1889 to John Douglas's design and were named after Cecil Parker, the first Duke of Westminster's land agent. The buildings were modelled on the New Style tenement buildings in London, considered to be the best form of social housing at that time. The facilities included inside toilets and running water, items that were unheard of amongst the working classes of the day. Ahead and on the right is the Church of St. Werburgh, considered to be the present-day Roman Catholic cathedral. It was designed by the Liverpool architect Edmund Kirby. Built in light grey stone, it was commissioned in 1873, although the building work was only completed in 1914. To the right are the Victorian public swimming baths, the work of the talented local architect John Douglas. Built in a mixture of red brick and mock Tudor style in 1900, it still serves today as a swimming pool for local swimming clubs and schools. On the left is Grosvenor Park. Richard Grosvenor, the second Marquis of Westminster, gave this 20 acres of land to the citizens of Chester to provide them with a park for their recreation. The Marquis paid for the design and laying out of the park, and to show their gratitude, the local citizens contributed around £5,000 for a marble statue of the Marquis, which can still be seen in the park today. We are now at stop 5, Vickers Lane. A light here for Grosvenor Park, the Roman Amphitheatre and St. John the Baptist Church. St. John the Baptist Church is on the left. Evidence suggests that in 689 AD, a Saxon minster was founded here. Parts of the present building date to the Norman period, at which point it became the cathedral of the Diocese of Mercia for the next 27 years. The church lost its cathedral status in 1102, eventually becoming a parish church in the 16th century. Part of the east end of the chancel fell out of use, and following the truncation of the north and south transepts, the building is now 1/3 of its original size. Today, the external appearance is a result of Victorian restoration work carried out in the 1860s. St. John's is still used for worship today and is always open to visitors. Chester's first public meeting place, the Roman Amphitheatre, is ahead on the left, where it was built in a commanding position on the southeastern side of the fortress. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first amphitheatre was built around 80 AD, later to be replaced by a larger monumental stone structure. The outer walls reached 30 feet, twice the height of the city walls seen ahead, and provided seating capacity for approximately 7,000 people. Recent excavations revealed the outer walls of the two structures. The modern low sandstone walls rest on the top of the original walls buried beneath them. The large mural on the rear wall creates the illusion of how the total amphitheatre would have appeared in Roman times. We are now about to enter Suter's Lane. Please be aware that tree branches may occasionally overhang the bus. Suter is the old word for a shoemaker, and anyone who worked with leather had their tanneries in this area. We shall soon be arriving at the River Dee, where leather workers needed the continual supplies of river water to treat their hides and skins. We are approaching stop 6, the Groves. A light here for river trips and riverside walks. The river trip takes half an hour, and upon your return, another tour bus will arrive shortly to take you on with the tour. If you have not already purchased a combined bus and boat ticket, then you can upgrade your ticket with the driver, who will be happy to give advice and save you money. 2-hour boat trips are also available on a seasonal basis, so if you are interested, then speak to one of the boat staff on the river bank for further information. This area is known as the Groves and was laid out by the Victorians and became their favourite meeting place. Charles Brown, the owner of the prestigious Brown's department store, was responsible for planting the grove of lime trees along the river front, thus giving the area its name. It is still as popular today with the locals as it was in the 19th century, and many events take place on the River Dee. The source of the river is just to the west of Lake Bala in North Wales. It then flows north-eastwards, passing through the beautiful Vale of Llangollen, then through Chester and onward to the Irish Sea. This stretch of the river is used mainly for leisure purposes today, so it's hard to believe that the river itself was one of the main reasons for the Romans building their fortress here, because it enabled them to establish a thriving commercial port which existed until the 18th century. Chester's famous zoo is situated just a few miles from the city centre. The founder, George Mottershead, visited a zoo in Manchester when he was a young boy in 1903. As an animal lover, he was horrified to see all the animals kept in cages, and it fueled his concept of building a zoo without bars. He eventually bought land and a rundown property near Chester called Oakfield. George and his family worked hard to build up the zoo and help realise his dream. Instead of bars, moats, ditches and grassy woodlands were created to protect the public. Although there was great opposition from local residents, the zoo was finally opened to the public in 1931. Set in lovely grounds, the zoo's land area and species of animals have greatly increased over the years, thus enabling their important conservation programme to continue. The legions of Rome were the first professional fighting forces in history, but it was a hard life for a soldier stationed in the cold, wet northern fortress of Diva. The Roman legionary soldiers signed up for a period of 25 years, many of them knowing that they would never see their native land again. Tombstones found in Chester show that men were recruited from countries all over the empire, including Germany, Turkey and Iraq. They were mostly poor, unskilled men, and usually joined up for the regular pay, part of which would have been in salt. In early centuries, salt was a very valuable commodity, and it's said that the present-day word salary was derived from the fact that the Romans were paid by this method so many centuries ago. If they were lucky enough to reach retirement, they were paid a pension and possibly given some land. In wartime, they frequently marched about 30 kilometres a day, carrying kit weighing 40 kilos, double the weight carried by the armed forces today. To sustain them on long marches, the basic diet consisted of wheat, which was used to make bread, hard biscuits and porridge, all of which they baked themselves, supplementing the meal with vegetables and meat. Personal hygiene was important to them. They washed their teeth and hair in urine, and as for toilet paper, they normally used a communal sponge on a stick, which after use was dipped in vinegar to clean it. Bathing entailed rubbing oil over the body, entering the steam room to promote a sweat, and then scraping the skin with a bone instrument known as a strigil. Any off-duty time would have been spent outside the fortress in the canabi, the civilian settlement, maybe with their common law wives or with colleagues whilst gambling, drinking or shopping. The amphitheatre would have been another favourite place to relax, as also was the bathhouse, where soldiers would sit in the steam room, catching up with all the latest gossip of the day. The Chester mystery plays originated in the 14th century, nearly 700 years ago. Church services were conducted in Latin, and the monks at St. Werburgh's Abbey enacted stories from the Bible to help the poorer, illiterate people to understand. Eventually, this proved too disruptive, and the plays were moved outside the abbey. Various craftsmen guilds adopted them, with, for example, the grocers, bakers and millers performing the Last Supper, and the ironmongers enacting the Crucifixion. The guilds staged their plays on open wagons, which trundled through the streets to venues where audiences had gathered. Mystery plays were banned nationally in the 16th century, with Chester being the last to concede in 1578. Revived in 1951 for the Festival of Britain, they have since been staged every 5 years, proving to be one of the city's most popular attractions. Chester is proud of a number of famous people who've had associations with the city. The politician John Prescott lived in Chester when he was a boy, and the former Prime Minister, William Gladstone, had a home just across the border in North Wales. The Beatles, Liverpool's most famous group, performed in Chester on several occasions. John Lennon's grandmother, Annie Millwood, was born in the city townhouse of the Earls of Shrewsbury. Today this building is known as the Bear and Billet Pub in Lower Bridge Street. Charles Kingsley, the author of The Water Babies, was the canon of Chester's Cathedral in 1870. Lewis Carroll, who lived nearby, was the author of Alice in Wonderland, which featured the famous Cheshire Cat. Daniel Craig, the famous theatre and film actor, was born in Chester in 1968. He attained international fame in 2005 when he was given the role of James Bond in the film Casino Royale. The famous footballers Michael Owen and Danny Murphy were both born in Chester. Liverpool Football Club is just one of the many clubs that they have played for. They have also both represented England at international level. Finally, William Frederick Cody, better known as Buffalo Bill, was accompanied by Annie Oakley when he visited Chester in 1903 to perform his Wild West show on the Rudee racecourse. We now leave the Groves and the River Dee behind to retrace our way up Sutter's Lane. Between the city walls and the lower boundary wall to the left is what is known as the Roman Garden, although it certainly wasn't a garden in Roman times. It was developed in the 1940s to display some of the many Roman artefacts that have been found around the city during excavations. A fine view of the gardens can be seen as we turn left at the top of the lane. Turning left, we pass through the eastern wall by way of the new gate. This modern gate was designed by Sir Walter Tapper and built in 1938. Immediately to its right, dating from the medieval period, sits the original gate, known as the Pepper Gate or the Wolf Gate. By the 1930s, with increasing traffic on the roads, severe congestion occurred under the tiny archway, resulting in the newer, wider bridge being built. We are now at stop 7, Pepper Street. Alight here for the Rose, Bridge Street, Chester Cross and the Diva Roman Discovery Centre. In the pedestrianised heart of Chester, there's an area known as the Cross, where the city's 4 main streets converge. An intersection has existed here since the Roman occupation in the 1st century AD. Bridge Street, Watergate Street and Eastgate Street follow the course of the original Roman roads. Only Northgate Street at the southern end is post-Roman, resulting in the staggered crossroads seen at this point. The name of this important area of the city dates back to the medieval period, when a high cross built of local red sandstone was erected in the 14th century. In 1646, during the English Civil War, the cross was demolished after the surrender of Chester to the parliamentarians. Ahead, on the left, is the old Falcon Inn. In earlier times, it was the townhouse of the wealthy Grosvenor family. As they do today, and as they have done for centuries, they lived on their estate outside the walls. By the 1970s, the building was in a dilapidated state, and the late 6th Duke, Gerald Grosvenor, carried out restoration work on the building, for which in 1983 he received an award for his efforts. We are now at stop 8, Grosvenor Street. A light here for the Rose, the Grosvenor and Military Museums, and the Castle. Ahead, on the left, is the Grosvenor Museum, which was built in 1885. The museum is named after Hugh Grosvenor, the first Duke of Westminster, who donated the land and also subscribed £4,000 towards the building costs. The museum contains numerous galleries and exhibitions, including, amongst others, the award-winning Roman Stones Gallery, which features the largest collection of Roman headstones in the country. Admission is free, but donations are appreciated. On the left, at the roundabout ahead, is Chester's more modern castle. It was designed in the classical style by the architect Thomas Harrison. Building work commenced in 1788, but because it took another 34 years to complete, Harrison built a home here to enable him to supervise the work. Today, it not only houses the Military Museum, but is also the Crown Courts of Cheshire, where many famous trials have taken place. Chester's famous racecourse can be seen ahead on the right. Horse racing began here in 1539, making it not only the oldest racecourse in Great Britain, but now officially in the world. Before racing took place, the area would have been a sports ground of sorts. Centuries ago, this is where the apprentices of the Craftsmen's Guild played football. But sad to say that even in those times, the games had to be abandoned because of spectator violence. Prior to this, the area was a water meadow. As the high tides of the river came in, the area would flood. However, always left in the centre of the flooded area was a small island with a sandstone cross upon it. The old word for cross was rood, and one of the old words for an island was an E, and consequently that's how the racecourse came by the name it's known as today, the River Dee, or the Isle of the Cross. As well as a very full racing calendar commencing in May, the area hosts many other events throughout the season. These include show jumping, football and polo matches, an exciting Roman day with chariot racing, various concerts and exhibitions, and ends with a spectacular firework display in November. The bus is now in an area known as Handbridge, one of the oldest suburbs in the city. To both left and right is Olde Cemetery, developed by the Victorians in the 19th century. There is a section of war graves on the right, and many of Chester's famous dignitaries lie at rest to the left. Olde Cemetery opened in 1850 and was the resting place of many interesting characters. One such character was Edward Langtry, who died in Chester in 1897. He was the husband of the notorious London actress Lily Langtry, who was the mistress of Edward VII. The only mourners at Edward's funeral were his brother and sister. Lily, of course, was absent, but she did send flowers. Mary and Kilroy Finney, who were the king and queen of the Romany gypsies, are buried here. It is a tradition in gypsy folklore that every time they pass a royal grave, they pay homage by placing flowers. Mary Jonas died when she was 85 and was buried here in 1899. Mary had 33 children, which included 15 sets of boy-girl twins, the highest number ever recorded, and consequently this event has its place in the Guinness Book of Records. In the 19th century, Handbridge became known as the Duke's Village. At that time, the first Duke, Hugh Lucas Grosvenor, set about building many of his estate workers' homes here. Look for the decorative houses coming into view on the left, which carry a blue-black diamond pattern in the brickwork. Fashionable in Tudor times, it was revived by the Victorians. The Duke employed this style in many of his brick properties because it appeared to portray lots of interwoven W's, thus highlighting the Westminster title. So delighted was he with his elevation to the dukedom that he emblazoned the pattern on numerous buildings around the city and beyond. The church, known as St. Mary's without the walls, could be seen to the left. It was consecrated in 1887, replacing the church of St. Mary's on the Hill, which stands within the city walls. The first Duke of Westminster paid for the parish church to be built so that his employees who lived in the village would have a place of worship. The Romans quarried vast amounts of sandstone in the Handbridge area. Ahead, on the left, is an area of parkland known as Edgar's Field. Two large outcrops of the exposed quarry face can still be seen, and carved into one of the faces of the rock is a Roman shrine dedicated to the goddess Minerva. According to legend, King Edgar, the first king of all England, had a palace here. When he visited this site in the 10th century, 8 vassal kings rode him up the river to St. John's Church and then back again to show their allegiance to him. The bus now crosses the river by the Olde Bridge. It has been established that a Roman ford once crossed here, and several wooden bridges stood here before the present stone bridge was built in the 13th century. To the right is Chester's Weir, which was built in the 11th century by Hugh Lucas, the first Norman Earl, who owned the Dee Mills, which once stood on the river bank to the left of the bridge gate ahead. Immediately beyond the bridge gate and to the left is the Baron Billet, which bears the date 1664. It was the last large black and white timber frame building to be built in the city before brick-built properties were introduced. On the left at first story level on top of the shops is a group of houses known as Gamel Terrace. The last house of the terrace is Gamel House. King Charles I is said to have stayed here as a guest after his defeat at the Battle of Rowton Moor, before making his escape to freedom into Wales. We are now at stop 10, Lower Bridge Street. A light here for the unique Chester Rose and the Diva Roman Discovery Centre. On the left, and said to be one of the most haunted buildings in the city, the old King's Head Hotel was built in 1622 as the Chester home of the Randall Hume family. They were wealthy merchants and constructed this lovely building from second-hand ship's timbers that they acquired from the old port of Chester. Could this have been done for economy, Or was it that the Randall Hume family were pioneers of the recycling that is so important today? Ahead, on the right, is the old Tudor house, and as can be seen, it leans very severely to one side. This is reputed to have occurred during the Civil War of the 17th century, when the building was said to have been struck by cannonballs fired by the invading parliamentarians who were very close to the city. As the bus turns left, directly ahead in the upper part of Bridge Street are the Chester Road, the amazing tiered shops that date from as early as the 13th century. They are unique to Chester throughout the world, and some of the finest timber-framed architecture can be seen in this very special area. The roads are a system of buildings with shops at both street level and at first floor level, where they have open upper galleries or roads which provide public walkways for the first-storey shops. When they were first built in the medieval period, the shopkeepers lived in the domestic accommodation which was behind the shop fronts at row level. As mentioned earlier, they are unique to Chester and can be found in all the four main streets of the city. As the bus turns right at the roundabout ahead, note the large circular building. The site was previously occupied by the Cheshire County Police Headquarters. The new building, completed in 2010, is still known as HQ and houses a hotel, restaurants, offices and private residences. The modern architecture has been thoughtfully designed in the style of a Roman Colosseum and has already received a prestigious award. We are now entering Nicholas Street, and immediately on the right is Chester's modern Magistrates' Court. Designed by the Cheshire County Architects Department, it was built in 1991 in the style of a Roman villa. It was given a Civic Award in 1995 for blending the fine example of modern architecture into an historic site. The elegant terrace of Georgian townhouses ahead and on the left were built in the 1780s. Designed by Joseph Turner in the fashionable London style, it is the longest example of this type of property remaining in Chester. Similar properties, which used to stand on the right, were demolished in the 1960s to make way for the Inner Ring Road. In the 19th century, the houses were mainly occupied by doctors who lived and practiced here, and hence the local people of the day nicknamed the street Pillbox Promenade. Turning left into the lower part of Watergate Street, take note of the fine black and white half-timbered building on the left, known as Stanley Palace. It was built in 1591 to be the Chester townhouse of the Stanleys, a prominent Cheshire family. The three inner gables belonged to the original house, but by the mid-19th century were in a state of disrepair. The tour continues through the western wall via the Watergate. Similarly to the Bridge Gate, it was designed by the architect Joseph Turner and was built in 1788. As the name suggests, it leads through to the old port area of the city, where the River Dee flowed close to the city walls. The custody of the gate was given to the Stanley family, who were later to become the Earls of Derby. We are now at stop 12, New Crane Street and the Holiday Inn. Alight here for the main entrance to the racecourse. We are now in Crane Street, which merges into New Crane Street. This part of the city is known as the Old Port Area, where the Romans established a thriving commercial port nearly 2,000 years ago. In the Middle Ages, the Crane Wharves were situated just outside the Watergate and ran along the westerly city wall. In 1558, Chester's port was recorded as second only to Bristol as the leading port on the western coast of England. The gradual silting of the river throughout the Middle Ages made the port difficult to use, and large vessels were eventually unable to reach Chester. by 1735 a new port area, New Crane Wharf, was established, enabling ships of up to 200 tons to reach the city. The complete decline and closure of the port took place in the late 18th century. As the bus turns right, shortly on the left could be seen an example of Chester's more recent architecture. Built in the shape of a sailing ship, it is known by the residents as Noah's Ark, and was built to be Chester's new Scout headquarters. In total contrast, on the right is the old water tower, which was built in 1322 at a cost of £100. It was built for two reasons. Firstly, to provide extra defence for the city, and secondly, to provide moorings for the larger ships unable to reach the harbour. As we turn right, the Shropshire Union Canal and Tower Wharf are on the left. To the right, the three black and white staircase locks are hewn out of solid rock in order to provide the means of raising and lowering barges some 33 feet between the upper canal and the lower canal basin. These locks, together with the canal basin, were designed by Thomas Telford, the famous engineer. Construction work started on the Chester Canal in 1772, but due to financial and engineering difficulties, Chester had to wait another 25 years before it became an important canal port. After the demise of Chester's river port, the canal system provided Chester with essential trade links to the port of Liverpool and the national network of canals. We are now in Canal Street, and the building at the far end on the right was originally built in 1717 as the Blue Coat School. It was founded by Nicholas Stratford, the Bishop of Chester, as a charitable school for the education of poor boys. As we turn left, Chester's Fountain Roundabout can be seen directly ahead of us. During its construction, the discovery here of many Roman headstones and tombs showed the area to have once been a Roman burial ground. The legions of Rome always buried their dead well away from their fortresses, because being a pagan people and believing in ghosts and evil spirits, they certainly wouldn't have wanted any such visitations whilst in their beds at night. Chester is known as the gateway into North Wales, with the border about 2 miles away, and to the left a fine view of the Welsh hills can be seen far away in the distance. The relationship between the Welsh and English hasn't always been as friendly as it is today. In the late 13th century, Edward I made Chester Castle the base for his campaigns in Wales. During the following century, Owen Glyndor's rebellion put Chester in real danger. In 1403, Prince Henry, who later became Henry V, made a proclamation that if any Welsh person were found inside the city walls after sunset, they would have their heads cut off. Up to now, no decapitations have been recorded, but any Welsh person on the bus today needs to know that the law has never ever been repealed. An unusual aircraft that can be frequently seen flying over Chester is known locally as the beluga, as it resembles the shape of a beluga whale. Based at the Airbus factory just across the North Wales border, the aircraft was specifically designed to transport manufactured aircraft wings to Toulouse in France, where the final assemblies are carried out. A confusing sight in the sky to identify when you see it for the first time, so look out for it. Leaving the roundabout, Chester's North Gate is directly ahead. In Roman times, this would have been the back entrance to the Roman fortress and was known as the Porta Decumana. When we turn to the right at the bottom of Delamere Street, the city northern wall will be directly ahead. 13 quarters of the Roman wall have survived here, and it is one of the finest examples of a Roman fortress wall in northern Europe. During the medieval period, the walls underwent huge changes, but today parts of the northern and easterly walls still stand on their original Roman foundations. We are now approaching Stop 1, the Chester Bus Interchange. Alight here for the Northgate Arena, Frodsham Street and Chester shopping areas. If you are leaving us now, we hope that you are